I honored the police's invitation to meet Dr. John Okapima at the State Correctional Center, where he was being held pending the conclusion of an investigation. As I entered the room where he was waiting, something about his face seemed vaguely familiar, though I couldn't immediately place him. I sat down across from him, with a police officer beside us holding a recording device. Dr. John Okapima looked at me with a broad smile and asked, "Do you remember me?" I shook my head, uncertain. Then, he began to sing a song that I used to sing with my playmates as a child. The tune stirred a wave of nostalgia, and I truthfully admitted that it reminded me of my youth. He pressed further, asking, "Do you remember Mama Ochuko?" The mention of that name made me pause. I looked at him more closely, searching his face until the realization hit me. "Ochuko, is that you?" I exclaimed, my voice filled with surprise. Ochuko had been the son of my father's second wife, who was sent away many years ago. He was the only sibling I had growing up, as my father had only 2 sons. After my mother's death and the subsequent expulsion of Ochuko's mother, my father never remarried until his passing. Ochuko had always lingered in my mind as the only brother I ever knew, and I often wondered where life had taken him. In those days, Ochuko was my closest companion and biggest fan. As memories flooded back, my initial happiness and anxiety gave way to sadness and anger. "Ochuko," I asked him, "why did you change your name to John? And how did you end up in this situation? I've heard that you were plotting to eliminate me and my household." To my shock, he calmly confirmed it, saying that he had indeed planned to kill me. He explained, tears welling in his eyes, that it was because my father had cast him and his mother out, causing them to suffer immensely. He blamed my father for robbing him of his inheritance, which had eventually been given to me. Ochuko's voice trembled as he continued. "The day we were thrown out of your father's house, we had nowhere to go. My mother was in shock, just walking aimlessly with her belongings, as if she had lost her mind. I was only 5 years old then." He paused, wiping the tears that now flowed freely down his face. That night, as my mother later told me, we ended up sleeping under a bridge. In the middle of the night, some thugs found us. They didn't just steal all the belongings she had managed to carry with her, they also assaulted her. I was fast asleep, unaware of the horrors she endured. Ochuko's voice broke as he described how his mother, despite her physical and emotional pain, had risen the next morning to beg for money and food. "She gave the little she collected to me," he said, making sure I was fed, even though she was suffering in ways I couldn't comprehend. Ochuko went on to recount the endless struggles that followed. His mother, once a proud woman, was reduced to begging and doing menial jobs just to survive. She faced rejection, humiliation, and the crushing weight of hopelessness. Despite her efforts, they remained trapped in poverty, and the bitterness within Ochuko grew. He watched his mother suffer, and over time, resentment took root in his heart. As I grew older, Ochuko continued, "I realized that all the suffering we went through was because of your father's decision. I watched my mother, once full of life, wither away under the weight of poverty and shame. I vowed that one day, I would make you and your family pay for what was done to us because you are the recipient of all that my father had." He went on, his voice heavy with emotion. "It was tough, but I managed to get through primary and secondary school. I eventually received a scholarship to study medicine and became Dr. John Okapima, hiding my true identity until the right moment to strike." He paused, then added, "Sod, your wife, was a street girl I met and brought to my apartment one night. Afterward, I asked her to move in with me." Ochuko's revelation struck me like a blow. At that time, I reconnected with my mother, and together with Sod, we devised an evil plan to eliminate you. Sod was just acting all these years, she never loved you. She was always my girlfriend. She was supposed to marry you, live with you for a few years, then eliminate you so she could inherit all your money and property, everything that my father left behind for you. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a twisted sense of regret. The truth is, I had no plans for Sod after she completed her mission. In fact, I intended to kill her too so that everything that belonged to you, and what I should have inherited from my father, would eventually be mine. I stared at Ochuko, now known as John Okapima, with a mixture of sorrow and anger. Sod was just acting all these years. She never loved you. She was always my girlfriend. She was supposed to marry you, live with you for a few years, then eliminate you so she could inherit all your money and property, everything that my father left behind for you. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a twisted sense of regret. The truth is, I had no plans for Sod after she completed her mission. In fact, I intended to kill her too so that everything that belonged to you, and what I should have inherited from my father, would eventually be mine. I stared at Ochuko, now known as John Okapima, with a mixture of sorrow and anger. The police officer beside us shook his head, clearly disturbed by the story unfolding before him. After a few moments of silence, I asked Ochuko if he was aware of his mother's death. He acknowledged that he was. I then asked if he had read the apology letter his mother had left behind. When he said no, I requested that the police officer retrieve it, as Ochuko was handcuffed and his legs were chained to the table. Another policeman brought in a photocopy of the note, insisting they couldn't give him the original to avoid tampering with evidence. As I later learned, several officers were watching us from a screen. Ochuko read the note, and then burst into tears, shouting in disbelief that the contents couldn't be real. As he continued to cry, I found myself weeping with him. I interjected, saying, "Ochuko, I once asked my father, just before he died, why he sent you and your mother away. Do you know what he told me? He said you were not his legitimate child and that your mother caused my mother's death." Ochuko shook his head, acknowledging that he knew his mother was responsible for my mother's death. He said she had confessed to him much later when he was grown. I looked at him and said, "The work your mother started, you want to finish. You didn't know you weren't my father's legitimate son." His mother's note had also included the name of his real father, a local thug who was killed in a community fracas many years ago. I continued, "Ochuko, if you had come to me and identified yourself, I would have gladly shared our father's property with you, even though you have no legal right to it. I loved you like a brother, Ochuko. Instead, what you did was to plant Sod in my life and through her went to these lengths to eliminate me for a crime I never committed. Is that not wickedness of the highest order?" All he could do was to cry and ask me for forgiveness, admitting that he had been led astray by his mother, who had known the truth all along but let her greed and selfishness deceive Ochuko into such an evil plan. I got up and left him crying. At a point I came back and said, "What if those grave robbers did not show up that night? You and your mother would have killed me for nothing. Despite the fact that your wicked mother killed my mother and was aware of the truth about the whole situation, she still manipulated you, based on her greed and wickedness. God will judge you, Ochuko," I said before leaving. "You wicked soul." I repeated again, "God will judge you and Sod." I heard he was later charged to court and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, along with Sod. Sod delivered the baby at the State Correctional Center's health center, and after a few months, the baby was sent to a foster home.